The morning sun hung low over the glass walls of the international airport, turning the steel and glass terminal into a glowing cathedral of travel. Rolling suitcases hummed across polished floors, the muffled voices of flight announcements echoed over loudspeakers, and tired travelers shuffled from gate to gate. For most passengers, it was an ordinary day of business and vacation, but for Marcus Hill, today was meant to be a step into the next chapter of his life, quiet, purposeful, and successful. Marcus wasn't just another passenger. He was a man of quiet power, the kind of power that didn't need to shout to be felt. At 52 years old, he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had built everything through discipline and perseverance. His frame was lean but strong, his graying hair trimmed neatly, his tailored navy suit pressed as sharply as his gaze. To the untrained eye, he looked like an executive on another routine business trip. What most people didn't realize, what those who would soon cross him fatally underestimated, was that Marcus was far more than an executive. As he approached the gate for Flight 217, his boarding pass in hand, he noticed the small things. The young couple arguing softly about who had packed the passports. The elderly woman double-checking her handbag for the third time. The little boy tugging on his father's sleeve, pointing with excitement at the plane visible through the wide window. Marcus smiled faintly at the boy's wonder. Airplanes had lost their magic for him long ago, too many hours logged, too many conferences attended, but he never forgot that sense of awe he'd felt the first time he'd flown. When his boarding group was called, Marcus stepped into the line with the same unhurried dignity that defined his every movement. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scanned the morning's headlines, and slipped it back without distraction. His carry-on bag was sleek and minimal, documents carefully arranged, a leather notebook, and a tablet tucked inside. Everything about him spoke of order. But order, in this world, is fragile. As Marcus handed over his boarding pass, the gate agent smiled mechanically, her fingers tapping the scanner. A green light blinked. "Thank you, Mr. Hill. Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice as flat as routine. Marcus nodded politely and moved toward the jet bridge. That was the moment when the shift began, subtle at first, like the faint change in air pressure before a storm. A security officer standing near the gate tilted his head, watching Marcus more closely than he had watched the man in shorts and sandals just before. Another officer's eyes followed Marcus's back as he walked down the narrow tunnel toward the plane. Their expressions weren't neutral, they carried suspicion, the kind of suspicion reserved for those who looked like Marcus. Inside the aircraft, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and recirculated air, a familiar blend for any frequent traveler. Marcus stepped gracefully into the cabin, his eyes scanning the layout with practiced ease. First class gleamed with wide leather seats and polished fixtures. He offered a polite nod to a flight attendant, who returned it with professional courtesy, though her eyes flicked to the security officer entering just behind him. Marcus moved toward his seat, 2A, by the window, a prime spot that spoke not only of financial comfort but of the life he had earned. He placed his bag neatly in the overhead compartment, adjusted his jacket, and sat down. For a moment, everything was normal. He looked out the window, watching ground crew bustle around the tarmac. He glanced across the aisle at a young man already dozing, headphones pressed over his ears. The hum of boarding surrounded him, the shuffle of shoes, the thump of luggage against seats, the murmurs of passengers arranging themselves. And yet, the unease persisted. Marcus caught the quick glance exchanged between two flight attendants at the front. He noticed the way a uniformed security guard lingered just inside the cabin, scanning the passengers, his eyes returning again and again to Marcus. The guard leaned toward the lead attendant, whispered something, and she gave a small, uncertain nod. Marcus sat straighter, his mind calm but alert. He had lived long enough, and experienced enough quiet prejudice in boardrooms and airports alike, to recognize the first rumblings of trouble. Still, he said nothing. He adjusted his cufflinks, pulled out his notebook, and uncapped his pen. To anyone watching, he was just a man jotting down a few thoughts before takeoff. Inside, however, he was measuring the room, weighing stares, noting whispers, feeling the weight of an invisible judgment settle around him like fog. The seatbelt sign had not yet lit, but Marcus already felt strapped in, trapped not by the aircraft but by the eyes of those who had decided, for reasons unspoken, that he didn't belong. And as the last passengers trickled on board, Marcus knew, the flight hadn't even left the ground, and yet his journey today was about to take a very different course. The flight attendant's smile wavered. Marcus noticed it as she leaned slightly toward the uniformed officer, her hand brushing the edge of her clipboard like she needed something to hold on to. She whispered quickly, her eyes flicking in his direction. The officer gave a short nod and adjusted his posture, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for a performance. Marcus had seen this choreography before. In boardrooms, in hotels, at charity galas where he was the only man of his complexion among the wealthy elite. That furtive glance, the whispered consultation, the decision made about him without his inclusion. Prejudice did not always wear a hood. Sometimes it dressed in uniforms, tucked into polite smiles, and carried laminated ID cards. He tried to push it aside. He was here to travel, not to teach lessons. Yet when the officer began walking down the aisle with heavy steps, Marcus knew the lesson would be forced on him whether he wanted it or not. "Sir," the officer said, stopping beside Marcus's seat. His voice was low but not gentle. It carried the weight of suspicion already resolved. "Can you step off the plane with me for a moment?" Marcus looked up slowly, his expression calm, though his pulse thudded like a distant drumbeat. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone even, measured, the kind of voice he had cultivated over decades of board negotiations. The officer didn't answer the question. He simply gestured toward the aisle. "We need to have a quick conversation outside." Around them, passengers grew suddenly quiet. The soft hum of boarding evaporated. Eyes shifted toward the scene, curious, uncertain, some embarrassed to be caught staring, others staring boldly as though watching a show they had paid for. The young man across the aisle pulled down his headphones slightly, feigning nonchalance but listening intently. Marcus folded his notebook deliberately, slid the pen into its loop, and placed it into the seat pocket. He moved without hurry, rising with quiet dignity, adjusting his jacket as though preparing for a board presentation. If they wanted a performance, he would not give them the one they expected, no anger, no raised voice, no scene. Only poise. "May I ask the nature of this conversation?" Marcus said as he stepped into the aisle. The officer shifted. "A passenger expressed concern," he said vaguely. "It's just procedure." Procedure. Marcus had heard that word more times than he could count. Procedure was the velvet glove over the iron fist, the excuse for every humiliation. Procedure was how men who looked like him were asked to wait longer, question harder, doubted quicker. "I see," Marcus replied, his eyes steady. "Then let's have this conversation." As they moved toward the front, the flight attendant stepped back, creating a narrow channel as though he were radioactive. Marcus could feel the passenger's eyes tracking him, burning holes into the back of his suit. Some looked away, guilt in their faces, others leaned forward eagerly, relishing the spectacle. The jet bridge was cooler, the recycled air giving way to the raw scent of metal and oil. The officer stopped just beyond the aircraft door. Another guard was waiting there, arms crossed, jaw clenched. 2 against 1, a script Marcus knew too well. "Sir," the first officer said, lowering his voice as though speaking confidentially, "we've had a report that you were acting suspiciously during boarding." Marcus raised one eyebrow. "Suspiciously? In what way?" The guard hesitated, fumbling. "Just, suspicious. Looking around too much. Watching people." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity. He had been watching a child marvel at airplanes, an old woman searching her handbag, a couple arguing over passports. To them, his observation was threat, his attentiveness danger. The same behavior in another passenger would have been harmless, invisible. He drew a slow breath. "I am a frequent flyer. I was simply observing my surroundings. If that is suspicious, then perhaps the problem lies in perception, not in action." The second guard cut in sharply, his voice harsher. "We don't need an argument. You're being asked to step off the plane. We can't allow you to continue on this flight." For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy. Marcus felt it sink into his bones, that old familiar humiliation, the stripping away of dignity in front of strangers. His throat tightened, not from fear but from anger he refused to show. Passengers inside the cabin were still watching, some craning their necks through the open doorway. He could sense their eyes on him, recording the moment in their minds, the black man removed, the airline safe again. Marcus spoke softly, each word precise. "You're saying I have done nothing wrong. No violation. No disturbance. Yet you will not allow me to fly?" The first guard shifted uncomfortably, but the second one stood firm. "That's correct. Please collect your belongings." Marcus nodded once, a small gesture of surrender that was not truly surrender. He stepped back inside the cabin, walking slowly, every step deliberate. He retrieved his bag from the overhead compartment, pausing long enough for silence to stretch taut as a wire. The young boy he had smiled at earlier stared at him wide-eyed, confusion etched on his face. The boy's father put a hand on his shoulder, pulling him gently away. When Marcus returned to the jet bridge, he held his bag in one hand, his head high. "Very well," he said. "If this is how you wish to proceed, I will not resist. But know this, actions have consequences." The guards exchanged glances, smirks tugging at their mouths. To them, he was just another inconvenienced passenger, powerless against their authority. What they did not know, what they could not have imagined, was that the man they had just thrown off their plane was not powerless at all. He was a man who carried not just documents in his leather briefcase, but connections that stretched into boardrooms across continents, into the hearts of investors who commanded billions. And within minutes, he would place a call that would ripple through the airline's veins like a shockwave. For now, though, Marcus walked calmly down the jet bridge, escorted like a criminal, his dignity intact but his patience worn thin. He had been humiliated in front of strangers. But he carried with him the knowledge that this story was not over. It was only beginning. The jet bridge echoed with the sound of Marcus's polished shoes striking the floor. He walked steadily, his grip firm on the handle of his briefcase, his posture never bending. But every step felt like a stage light burning on his back, because the audience was still there, the passengers craning from the doorway, their faces lit with a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and unspoken judgment. He was no longer a man boarding a plane. He was the show. The black man pulled aside. The suspicious one escorted by security. When he reached the terminal entrance, the guards halted him in plain view of the boarding area. They didn't take him to a private room, didn't lower their voices, didn't offer him the dignity of discretion. Instead, they positioned themselves like walls on either side of him, one hand on his arm as though he might run. Passengers walking by slowed down. Some pulled out their phones, pretending to check emails but holding them just high enough to record. Others whispered to companions. A woman clutched her purse closer as she passed. The humiliation was sharp, suffocating, and Marcus felt it pressing against his chest like a weight. The lead officer spoke loudly, his words carrying through the terminal. "Sir, you've been asked to leave this flight. Please remain calm while we process this." Remain calm. The irony almost broke Marcus's composure. He was the calmest man in the room, his voice steady, his movements measured. It was the officers who radiated hostility, who framed his every breath as potential danger. "Process what?" Marcus asked, his voice even. "You've admitted I've done nothing wrong." The second officer snorted. "Sir, don't make this harder than it has to be." Passengers gathering nearby heard only fragments: harder, suspicious, removed. The story was already writing itself in their eyes, not by fact but by perception. Marcus knew how perception worked. A black man in handcuffs was a criminal, whether guilty or not. A black man standing between two guards was a threat, no matter how calm his tone. A gate agent appeared, holding a clipboard like a shield. She avoided Marcus's gaze, speaking only to the officers. "Do you want him rebooked or?" "Denied boarding," the guard said firmly. The word sliced deeper than he expected. Denied. Like access to opportunity, to belonging, to dignity. One word carried the weight of centuries, and today it carried the force of an airline's authority. Marcus set his briefcase down beside him, the leather making a soft thud against the floor. He drew himself up taller, his voice rising not in anger but in resonance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning his head slightly toward the onlookers, "let it be clear, I have been accused of nothing. I have violated no law, no regulation. I am being removed for existing in a space some people believe I should not occupy." The terminal went still. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, others nodded faintly, their eyes acknowledging truth but their lips sealed in fear of involvement. One woman whispered audibly, "It's not right," but she didn't step closer. Another man shook his head, muttering, "Always the same," but returned quickly to his seat. The officers stiffened. The lead one leaned in, lowering his voice to a threatening growl. "You need to stop talking now." Marcus's eyes locked on his. "Why? Does the truth unsettle you?" The guard's jaw clenched. "Pick up your bag and move. Now." The command was sharp, final. Marcus bent, picked up his briefcase, and straightened once more. For a fleeting second, he thought of his father, a man who had lived through the marches of the 1960s, who had taught him that dignity was resistance, that silence was sometimes the loudest scream. He carried that lesson now, standing straighter than the guards, calmer than the crowd, his every breath a quiet rebellion. He began walking toward the exit, escorted on both sides. Passengers watched, silent, some ashamed, some complicit, some entertained. The whispers swirled. What did he do? Why'd they take him off? He looked important, maybe dangerous. Each whisper was a knife. Each glance another verdict passed without trial. At the security podium, the final insult came. The officer took his boarding pass, ripped it down the middle, and tossed it into the trash. "You won't be flying with us today," he said coldly. Marcus looked at the torn paper, then at the officer. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried weight enough to cut through the terminal noise. "You've just made the costliest decision of your career." The officer scoffed, unconcerned. "Is that a threat?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "No. Just a truth." With that, he turned, walking away from the gate area. The crowd parted as he moved through, their eyes still on him, their silence complicit. He walked with steady steps, each one echoing louder than the guard's commands, louder than the passengers' whispers. Inside, though, he felt the heat of humiliation burning. He had been treated not as a man of accomplishment, not as a citizen, not even as a paying customer, but as a problem to be removed, a presence to be erased. But humiliation, Marcus knew, could be alchemized. Anger could be transformed. And dignity, once stripped, could be rebuilt into something stronger. When he reached the quieter stretch of the terminal, away from prying eyes, he paused. He set down his briefcase again, opened it, and pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, not trembling, not uncertain. This was not a call made in anger. This was a call made in power. The guards thought they had won. The airline thought it had flexed its authority. The passengers thought the story ended with him walking away. They were all wrong. Marcus scrolled through his contacts until he found a name that could shift billions with a single word. He tapped it. The line rang once. Twice. "Marcus," a voice answered, smooth and direct. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you today." "They just threw me off a plane," Marcus said simply, his voice steady, his dignity intact. "It's time to talk about that funding." And with that, the humiliation transformed into a weapon sharper than any blade. Marcus walked away from the gate, his briefcase in hand, his posture still impossibly straight despite the sting of humiliation gnawing inside. The terminal's bright advertisements and cheery departure boards mocked him with their normalcy. He had been paraded like a criminal before strangers. Yet, instead of rage consuming him, a strange clarity settled over him, as though the injustice had sharpened his purpose into a blade. He reached a quieter corner of the terminal, away from the prying eyes of travelers. There, beneath the sterile glow of recessed lighting, he set his briefcase gently on a bench and pulled out his phone. His reflection looked back at him from the dark screen, the same calm face, the same steady gaze, but behind his eyes, something moved, resolve. Marcus scrolled through his contacts with the precision of a man selecting the right key for a lock. Names flickered past, senators, CEOs, old friends from Harvard, board members from 3 continents. Finally, his thumb hovered over a name, Jonathan Price. Jonathan wasn't just another financier. He was the managing partner of a global investment consortium that held major stakes in industries ranging from energy to aviation. He was a man whose voice could shift markets, whose nod could redirect billions. Marcus tapped the name. The line rang once. Twice. Then a click. "Marcus," Jonathan said, his voice warm, familiar, yet edged with curiosity. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you today. Where are you off to this time?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "Nowhere, it seems. I was just thrown off a plane." There was a pause, silence sharp as glass. Then Jonathan's tone hardened. "Thrown off? By whom?" "By the airline you and I have discussed so many times," Marcus replied evenly. "Security decided my presence was suspicious. No explanation. No infraction. Just suspicion." Jonathan's sigh was heavy, the kind that carried both disbelief and anger. "Unbelievable. Which flight? Flight 217. Gate C12. I was treated as though I were a criminal. In front of everyone. Marcus's words weren't emotional, they were factual, surgical, like an attorney laying out evidence before a jury. He didn't need to embellish. The truth carried more weight than anger ever could. Jonathan's voice lowered. Marcus, you know how much exposure we have in that airline. $4 billion tied up in equity, credit lines, long-term infrastructure deals. If they've crossed you. They have, Marcus interrupted quietly. And this isn't just about me. It's about every man who looks like me, treated as though dignity is optional. We've overlooked too much in the name of convenience. Today, they chose the wrong passenger. Another silence. Marcus could almost hear the gears turning in Jonathan's mind, the calculations forming. Jonathan Price was not a man ruled by sentiment, he was ruled by numbers, returns, stability. Yet he was also ruled by loyalty. And his loyalty to Marcus went deeper than contracts. They had weathered storms together, financial crises, political pressure, hostile takeovers. Marcus had saved Jonathan's empire once before. This was the moment Jonathan could repay that debt. I'll convene the board, Jonathan said finally, his voice like a gavel. Give me an hour. No, less. 30 minutes. We'll put everything on the table. Good, Marcus said softly. They need to understand what they've done. And they need to feel it, not just hear it. Jonathan chuckled grimly. Oh, they'll feel it. Believe me. When the call ended, Marcus sat for a moment, staring at his phone screen as though it were a loaded weapon. Around him, the terminal buzzed with the oblivious rhythm of travel. Families laughed, flight attendants wheeled carts, announcements droned. None of them realized that within this quiet corner, the trajectory of a corporation, perhaps an entire industry, had just shifted. Marcus leaned back, memories stirring. His father had always told him, son, the world will try to strip your dignity, but never your will. The day they underestimate you is the day you remind them who you are. This was that day. His phone buzzed again, startling him from thought. Jonathan's name flashed on the screen. Marcus answered. They're already scrambling, Jonathan said, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. Word's out that funding is at risk. Calls are being made from the airline's top brass to every director they can reach. Panic is setting in. Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile. Good. Let them scramble. Let them taste uncertainty. It's the same uncertainty they force onto people like me every day without a thought. Jonathan laughed bitterly. You know, I almost feel sorry for them. Almost. But $4 billion isn't just money, it's reputation. Once word spreads that they've angered us, other investors will scatter. Their stock will bleed by morning. Then let it bleed, Marcus replied. His voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of centuries of injustice. Maybe it will cleanse something. He ended the call and closed his eyes briefly. The humiliation of the morning still lingered, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like fuel. Across the terminal, the same officers who had escorted him off the plane lingered near the gate, their laughter quiet but pointed, as though reliving their triumph. Marcus glanced at them once, then turned away. Soon, they would learn, not from him, but from their own superiors, just how grave their mistake had been. It was not revenge Marcus sought. It was accountability. And accountability, he knew, always began with pressure. As he rose, slipping his phone back into his pocket, he felt taller than he had walking onto that plane. They had tried to reduce him to a spectacle, to erase his presence with humiliation. Instead, they had amplified his voice. And this was only the beginning. In the high-rise headquarters of the airline, the morning had begun like any other. Executives sipped coffee from porcelain mugs, analysts scanned flight metrics, and assistants whispered updates about schedules and press calls. The city skyline gleamed outside their glass fortress, a symbol of stability and dominance. But stability has fragile bones. It only takes one tremor to make skyscrapers shudder. The tremor arrived not in the form of a storm or financial downturn but as a single phone call. Marcus's voice carried through Jonathan Price, and within minutes the airline's leadership was thrust into chaos. At precisely 9:47 a.m., the chief financial officer, Elena Ramirez, received the first alert: Price Global reviewing exposure, $4 billion airline investment. Her phone buzzed again, urgent. Call with consortium in 15 minutes. She froze mid-sip of coffee, her eyes narrowing at the screen. Price Global wasn't just another investor, they were the keystone of the airline's financial structure. If they wavered, others would topple like dominoes. By 10 a.m., the CEO, Charles Dwyer, was yanked from a breakfast meeting and ushered into a glass-walled boardroom. His tie hung loose, his expression sharp with irritation. "What's this nonsense about Price Global pulling funding?" he snapped. Elena pushed a tablet across the table, its screen filled with messages. "It's not nonsense. Price is convening their board. They're considering freezing or pulling their stake, $4 billion. They've gone dark to us, which means they're serious." Charles paled. He was a man used to power, to being the one who made others sweat. But $4 billion wasn't just money. It was leverage, reputation, oxygen. Without it, the airline's future looked like a bird with clipped wings. "How did this start?" Charles demanded. A vice president cleared his throat. "It's connected to a passenger incident this morning. A man was removed from one of our flights. No charges. No violation. Just, removed." Charles's jaw tightened. "So we removed one passenger and suddenly we're losing billions? Who is he, the president?" The VP hesitated. "His name is Marcus Hill." The name meant nothing to Charles, but to Elena, it rang like a warning bell. She had heard the name whispered in financial circles. Hill wasn't on magazine covers, didn't flaunt wealth in tabloids, but his shadow stretched long. He was an institutional whisperer, a man whose advice shaped markets, whose endorsement could open doors to funding, and whose disapproval could slam them shut. Charles slammed his palm on the table. "Get me comms. Get me legal. Get me security. Whoever was involved in this incident. I want details now." As the boardroom scrambled, Marcus sat quietly in the terminal, sipping a coffee he had purchased without hurry. He was a storm in stillness, and the airline had not yet realized how much lightning he carried. By 10:30 a.m., the first cracks reached the media. A journalist from a financial newswire received a tip: rumors, Price Global rethinking airline stake. Another message followed: possible passenger discrimination incident linked. The story was small, a whisper among headlines, but like sparks in dry grass, it only needed a breeze. The breeze came from social media. A passenger who had witnessed Marcus's removal posted shaky footage online. Marcus, calm and dignified, flanked by officers, stating clearly, "I have done nothing wrong." The video gained traction within minutes, hashtags forming like storm clouds, hashtag flying while black, hashtag airline bias, hashtag Marcus Hill. At 11:15 a.m., a young intern rushed breathlessly into the airline's communications office. "Sir, we've got a trending problem." He spun his laptop around. The video had crossed 500,000 views. By the time Charles saw it, the number had doubled. The CEO's face flushed red. "Find him," he barked. "Find Hill. Apologize. Compensate. Do whatever it takes. We cannot afford this." But Marcus wasn't answering calls. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any statement. Back in the boardroom, Elena spoke carefully. "Charles, this isn't just optics. Price Global is pulling strings. If they withdraw, other investors will panic. The banks will tighten credit. Our stock will dive. This could trigger a cascade we can't stop." Charles paced the length of the room, his polished shoes tapping against the glass floor. He had weathered crises before: oil spikes, labor strikes, even a grounding of half the fleet during a maintenance scandal. But never had one man, one passenger, set off alarms across Wall Street. By noon, the airline's lobbyists were calling senators, begging for calm. The communications team drafted statements: "We take allegations seriously. We value diversity. We are reviewing the incident." But none of it mattered. The narrative was out of their hands now. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in quiet reflection, phone resting on the table beside his coffee. He didn't scroll through the chaos he knew was unfolding. He didn't need to. He trusted Jonathan's words: "They're scrambling." And Marcus understood that sometimes silence, paired with patience, was the most devastating response. At 1 p.m., another newswire flashed: airline stock falls 8% amid investor uncertainty. The numbers glowed red on trading screens. Analysts speculated on television, their voices grave: "This isn't about one incident. It's about perception. Investors are spooked." In the executive suite, panic turned to blame. Why did security target him? Who made the call? Charles roared. But answers were slippery, lost in the fog of procedure and prejudice. No one wanted to admit the truth, that Marcus had been removed not for action, but for appearance. By 2 p.m., the boardroom resembled a bunker. Lawyers whispered of class action suits. Public relations teams prepared crisis roadmaps. Charles rubbed his temples, his arrogance draining. $4 billion, he muttered. Gone. Over a seat on a plane. He was wrong. It wasn't about a seat. It was about dignity. About the price of underestimating the wrong man. And while the airline clawed at solutions, Marcus finished his coffee, stood, and gathered his things. He didn't storm out, didn't gloat. He simply walked with the same measured calm he had shown since the beginning. For Marcus, the ripples had only just begun. The tsunami was still to come. By mid-afternoon, the city skyline outside the airline's headquarters no longer gleamed with confidence. It brooded, glass towers shadowed by the weight of headlines rolling across financial tickers. What had begun as a whisper in the terminal was now a thunderclap echoing through Wall Street. The airline's executive suite pulsed with frantic energy. Phones rang without pause. Assistants darted in and out, faces pale, arms full of papers no one had time to read. Screens in the boardroom glowed with charts, red arrows plunging downward like daggers. Every seat at the long mahogany table was filled, yet the air felt empty of control. Price Global has frozen all pending transfers, Elena Ramirez, the CFO, announced, her voice brittle. That includes the $750 million credit facility due to renew next week. Effective immediately, all negotiations are suspended. A hush fell. Charles Dwyer, the CEO, stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign language. Suspended? You mean delayed? Surely. No, Elena cut in, her voice cracking with urgency. Frozen. Their board met within the hour. Until this incident is resolved, and until Marcus Hill is satisfied, Price Global will not release another cent. The words dropped like stones into the room. $4 billion of oxygen had been sucked out of the airline's lungs, and the suffocation was immediate. Charles slammed his fist on the table. Over one passenger? This is absurd. But absurdity did not change balance sheets. It did not soothe jittery investors, nor did it halt the avalanche gathering speed. At 2:45 p.m., the first domino fell. A Swiss investment fund issued a statement. In light of recent uncertainties, we are reassessing our exposure to the airline sector. Their position was small compared to Price Global's, but the signal was devastating. By 3 p.m., 2 pension funds followed suit. Banks began quietly tightening credit lines, pulling back short-term financing. In the trading floors downtown, brokers barked orders, screens flashing as the airline stock plummeted another 5%. Anchors on financial news channels spoke in grave tones. This could be the beginning of a liquidity crisis. The airline's crisis team scrambled. Lawyers whispered about discrimination suits. Public relations staff drafted yet another statement. We are committed to investigating the incident and reaching out to the passenger involved. But no statement could stop the bleeding. Because Marcus Hill had not spoken. And his silence was interpreted as judgment. Meanwhile, in a quiet cafe across town, Marcus sipped tea. He had chosen a seat near the window, the hum of conversation around him gentle and indifferent. He checked his phone sparingly, not to monitor chaos but to answer Jonathan's occasional updates. There in free fall, Jonathan had texted. Stock down double digits. Analysts predicting credit downgrade. Their board is in open panic. Marcus typed only 3 words in reply, let them learn. Back in the boardroom, the airline's general counsel stood, her face ashen. We've received notice from regulators. They want an immediate report of the incident. Civil rights groups are already calling for federal investigation. This isn't going away. Charles rubbed his temples, sweat gathering at his brow. He was a man who had built his career on charm and bluster, but charm was useless against market logic. We need to reach Hill, he muttered. We need to apologize, offer restitution, offer. Elena shook her head. You don't understand. This isn't about money. Hill doesn't need our money. He commands more than we could ever pay. He wants accountability. And right now, we don't even know how to spell the word. As if to punctuate her words, another phone buzzed. A junior analyst read the message aloud. Bank of East Asia just pulled their line of credit. Effective immediately. The room erupted. Voices overlapped, panic rising like floodwater. That's 3 major financiers in an hour. We'll lose our rating. This could ground the fleet. Charles bellowed, enough. The room fell silent, though the fear remained, thick and suffocating. He stood at the head of the table, his tie loose, his face pale. We are not going to collapse over one man. We've survived fuel crises, recessions, even bankruptcy once. We'll survive this. But the conviction in his voice was brittle. Everyone knew it. This wasn't one man. This was $4 billion of trust evaporating, and with it the confidence of the entire market. By 4 p.m., news anchors on primetime television led with the story, Airline stock nosedives amid allegations of racial discrimination. Major investors freeze funding. The shaky cell phone video of Marcus's removal played on repeat, his calm voice echoing across living rooms, "I have done nothing wrong." The public saw a man humiliated. Investors saw a liability. Together, they created a storm the airline could not contain. At 5 p.m., Price Global issued its first public statement, "We take matters of corporate responsibility seriously. Until further notice, we are suspending funding commitments to the airline pending a full review." The statement landed like a hammer. Other investors scattered. Hedge funds shorted the stock aggressively. By market close, the airline's valuation had lost billions. In the boardroom, silence reigned. Executives sat slumped, faces drained, as though the walls themselves had caved in. Elena finally broke the quiet. "This isn't a freeze. It's a collapse. By tomorrow, this could spread across the industry." Charles leaned heavily against the table, his voice barely audible. "Then tomorrow, we'll beg. We'll beg Hill, Price, anyone who will listen. We'll do whatever it takes." But begging would not erase what had been done. And Marcus, the man they had deemed unworthy of a seat on their plane, had become the fulcrum on which their empire tilted. As the the city's skyline reflected fire, a mirror of the burning panic within the airline's walls. And Marcus, walking calmly from the cafe, felt none of their chaos touch him. He carried his briefcase, his dignity intact, and the quiet knowledge that justice had begun not with protest or shouting, but with silence, and one phone call. The sun had set by the time the airline's board reconvened for the third emergency meeting of the day. Outside, the city's skyline glittered against the night sky, but inside the glass-walled boardroom, no light could disguise the faces of fear and fatigue. Executives who had strutted confidently that morning now sat slumped in their chairs, jackets discarded, ties loosened, voices rasping from hours of argument. The stock had closed down 19%. Analysts were predicting a credit downgrade within 48 hours. And the phones had not stopped ringing, regulators demanding answers, shareholders demanding explanations, and reporters demanding soundbites. At the head of the table, CEO Charles Dwyer looked like a man unraveling. His silver hair, usually combed immaculately, clung to his damp forehead. His eyes were bloodshot from staring at headlines he could not control. He was no longer the master of the airline. He was its hostage. "We need to reach Marcus Hill," Charles said for the 10th time that evening, his voice hoarse. "Where is he? Has anyone spoken to him?" Elena Ramirez, the CFO, shook her head. "He hasn't returned calls. Not ours, not the media's. Price Global won't broker anything without his word. Hill is silent, and silence right now is more powerful than any speech." The communications director, a wiry man named Grant, shuffled papers nervously. "We've prepared 3 different statements. One apologizes directly to Mr. Hill, one emphasizes diversity initiatives, and one outlines a full investigation. We can release them simultaneously across all platforms within the hour." Charles waved a hand impatiently. "Words. Empty words. Do you think a man who just cost us $4 billion cares about hashtags and polished apologies?" "He doesn't," Elena said flatly. "But the public does. Right now, perception is oxygen, and we're suffocating." The room fell quiet as the truth sank in. The airline had always lived on perception, safety, trust, respectability. In a single day, that veneer had been shattered. At 8:30 p.m., the board dialed into a video call with Price Global. Jonathan Price appeared on screen, his expression carved from granite. Behind him sat 6 other directors, each stone-faced. Charles straightened his tie and forced a smile. "Jonathan. Thank you for taking the call. We want to assure you that we are treating this matter with utmost seriousness. Our officers acted on." "Spare me," Jonathan interrupted, his tone icy. "Your officers acted on bias. Your staff humiliated a man of integrity, a man who has done more for global markets than your entire board combined. And now you come to us begging for leniency." Charles flushed. We regret the incident deeply. We're prepared to offer Mr. Hill compensation, first-class travel for life, anything he requests." Jonathan leaned closer to the camera. "You still don't understand. Hill doesn't want perks. He doesn't need your money. What he demands, and what we demand, is accountability. Who ordered his removal? Who signed off? Who stood by and watched?" No one spoke. The silence in the boardroom was suffocating. Jonathan's voice sharpened. "Until those answers are public, until responsibility is named and addressed, Price Global will not return a cent. And believe me, others will follow our lead. This isn't about one passenger. It's about the soul of your company." The call ended without pleasantries. The screen went dark, leaving the executives staring at their reflections, hollow-eyed and defeated. Charles slammed his fist against the table. "We need a scapegoat. Someone to take the fall." Murmurs filled the room, the head of security, the chief of operations, maybe even a flight attendant. Names were thrown like knives, each one an attempt to cut away the rot without touching the heart. But Elena spoke firmly. "Scapegoats won't save us. Hill is watching. He'll know the difference between theater and truth." Her words lingered, heavy with dread. At 10 p.m., desperate calls were made to Marcus's office, to his foundation, even to his alma mater's alumni network. Assistants begged for a meeting, a statement, a chance to apologize. Each request was met with polite silence. Marcus did not need to slam doors, he simply chose not to open them. Meanwhile, on television, the story dominated primetime news. Anchors replayed the footage of Marcus being escorted off the plane, his calm declaration, "I have done nothing wrong," echoing through millions of households. Civil rights leaders gave interviews. Politicians tweeted condemnations. By midnight, the airline's brand had become synonymous with prejudice. Inside the boardroom, exhaustion turned to despair. One executive muttered, "Maybe bankruptcy protection is the only way." Another whispered, "We could merge, rebrand, hide behind a new name." Charles buried his head in his hands. For a man who had once strutted through airports with cameras following, the humiliation was exquisite. He had thought himself untouchable. But power built on arrogance was brittle. And Marcus Hill had shattered it with nothing more than silence and dignity. At the same time, across town, Marcus sat in his study, the city lights stretching out like constellations beyond the window. His phone buzzed constantly, reporters, executives, old acquaintances offering advice. He ignored them all. He sat with a glass of water and his notebook, writing quietly. On one page, he wrote a single line, "Justice is not loud. It is steady." He knew the airline would scramble, that apologies would flow like rain. But he also knew words were cheap. What mattered now was whether they would face themselves honestly, whether they would dismantle the systems that made his removal possible. As the night deepened, Marcus closed the notebook and leaned back. He had no need to chase them. They were already chasing him. In the boardroom, the reckoning had begun. And in Marcus's silence, the lesson grew louder with every passing hour. The morning after the storm, the city woke to headlines that crackled across every screen and paper stand. Airline faces financial collapse amid discrimination scandal. $4B funding pulled after passengers' removal sparks outrage. Who is Marcus Hill? The man behind the meltdown. Stock tickers bled red. Analysts filled television studios with grim forecasts. Activists called for boycotts. Senators demanded hearings. It seemed that in a single day, the most powerful airline in the nation had been reduced to a symbol of arrogance and prejudice, all because of one man who refused to bend when others tried to humiliate him. But Marcus Hill did not celebrate. He did not sit before cameras or release fiery statements. He woke in his modest penthouse apartment, dressed in his usual pressed suit, and prepared breakfast with the same calm precision he had carried into every boardroom of his life. To him, dignity was not an event, it was a way of being. While the world burned around the airline, Marcus went about his day quietly. He answered emails from colleagues in Europe, reviewed documents for a philanthropic initiative, and spoke to Jonathan Price only once to thank him for his swift action. "It wasn't just me," Jonathan said. "It was you. You reminded them that power doesn't shout, it whispers, and the wise hear it." Marcus smiled faintly at that. He had not set out to topple a corporation. He had set out to board a plane. What followed was not vengeance but consequence. By mid-morning, the airline's executives stood before cameras, issuing apologies with trembling voices. Charles Dwyer's face, once smug with confidence, looked gaunt under the studio lights. "We deeply regret the incident involving Mr. Hill," he said, reading from a teleprompter. "We are committed to change, to accountability, and to ensuring nothing like this ever happens again." Reporters shouted questions. "Have you spoken to Mr. Hill? Will you resign? What about the investors pulling out?" Charles's answers were hollow. "We are reaching out, we are reviewing, we are committed," the words dissolved into air. In homes and offices across the country, viewers shook their heads. It was too little, too late. The public had already chosen the face of integrity, and it was not Charles Dwyer. It was Marcus Hill, the man calmly declaring, "I have done nothing wrong." At noon, Marcus left his apartment. He walked through the city streets without bodyguards, without fanfare, just a briefcase in hand and quiet purpose in his step. Strangers recognized him now, some nodded respectfully, others whispered his name as he passed. A young man stopped him outside a cafe. "Mr. Hill?" he asked, voice trembling. Marcus turned. "Yes." The young man swallowed hard. I just wanted to thank you. For standing tall. For reminding people like me that we don't have to bow our heads." Marcus placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You don't," he said simply. "Dignity is yours. Never let them take it." The young man nodded, eyes bright, and Marcus walked on. Across the city, the airline's headquarters felt like a tomb. Executives resigned behind closed doors. Lawsuits were drafted. Unions whispered about strikes. The collapse was not complete yet, but it had begun, and there was no reversing it. All from one call. All from one man. By evening, Marcus sat in his study again, the city lights sprawling before him like constellations. He opened his notebook, the same one he had carried onto the plane, and wrote another line beneath yesterday's. Power does not always roar. Sometimes it waits, quiet, until the world leans close enough to hear it. He closed the notebook and placed it carefully on his desk. He did not need to write more. The lesson was already written into the fabric of the day. In the days that followed, the story spread beyond finance and aviation. Civil rights leaders invoked his name in speeches. Universities used his calm defiance as a case study in ethics. Newspapers published editorials under titles like "The Power of One" and "Dignity in Silence." The airline stock never fully recovered. Charles Dwyer resigned under pressure within a month. Policies changed across the industry, not out of goodwill but out of fear of the next Marcus Hill. And though time would dull the sharpness of the scandal, the memory remained: a man thrown off a plane, his dignity intact, his silence louder than thunder. Marcus never granted an interview. When asked why, he simply replied, "The story isn't mine. It belongs to anyone who has been told they don't belong." And that was the power of it. Not money. Not revenge. Not spectacle. But the reminder that one person, armed only with calm conviction, could shake an empire. As the city drifted into night, Marcus stepped onto his balcony, the cool air brushing his face. He looked out over the skyline, the same skyline that had watched him be humiliated and then rise above it. One man. One phone call. One truth. The world had tried to strip him of dignity. Instead, he had shown them what dignity really was. And in that quiet, the lesson endured: the power of one can be enough to change everything.